Hello, and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Drew Holden. I'm the managing editor of American Compass and your special guest host for today's episode. I'm joined by Ethics and Public Policy Center fellow Patrick T. Brown to talk about a fantastic piece he wrote for the launch of our new magazine, Commonplace, about the mini baby boom that remote work helped deliver during the COVID pandemic. We talk about that surprising increase and what a policy approach supporting American parents could look like in a second Trump term, particularly with the GOP more open than ever to supporting families. Before we get to that, I need to tell you about some of the excellent pieces we have over at Commonplace, our magazine about what matters in America. Just this week, we have Michael Lind on why there won't be a deportation apocalypse as Trump's mass deportation of illegal aliens begins. And yesterday, Patrick Ruffini shared the inside scoop on how the political consulting class got it so wrong with Trump and the realignment in the Republican Party. Plus, thoughtful pieces about everything from the future of ESG and Trump's foreign policy to the wildfires that continue to devastate LA and the damaging regulations that could have made them worse. You can find all that and more at commonplace.org. And though he isn't here, I couldn't not give a shout out to Oren's ever insightful Substack, Understanding America. If somehow you haven't already, subscribe to it at understandingamerica.co. And be sure to read Patrick's piece at Commonplace. It's titled Remote Work Created a Baby Boom. Can we keep it up? And also subscribe to his newsletter, Family Matters, also on Substack. But without further ado, here is Patrick Brown. And Patrick Brown, thank you so much for joining the American Compass podcast.
Drew, great to be on. Thanks so much.
Of course, of course. Now, Patrick, you wrote a really excellent piece titled Remote Work Created a Baby Boom. Can we keep it up? For the launch of our new magazine last week. Wanted to pick your brain a little bit about it. We were talking before we got on here about it's interesting to kind of revisit the COVID through this lens, right? There's so many different ways we go back to COVID and so many different ways we talk about its impact. But one of the interesting and I think underappreciated ones that you write about here is there was a lot more births. So what happened and how was it different than what we've kind of come to expect?
Well, a lot is a generous interpretation, but it was definitely one of these unexpected wrinkles that I don't think any of us appreciated at the time. First of all, I should congratulate you, Drew, and Helen and Oren and the team on the launch of Commonplace. It's an exciting new voice on the right, and look forward to writing for it again in the future. But I was glad to have the opportunity to kind of revisit some of these discussions because, I mean, think back to March, April 2020. There was some sort of tongue-in-cheek headlines about, oh, well, all these people with all this time on their hands, what are they going to
Right.
do? We're going to see a
Yeah.
baby boom. And at the time, people were like, oh, wow, birds continue to fall, maybe there's other things going on. As we were able to kind of uncover some of this stuff looking back, it actually turned out there was a mini baby boom in the late 2020 heading into 2021. And I don't think that was because of the lockdowns or anything like to do with that. But when you look at who had babies, it was predominantly college educated married women who tended to be the ones who were juggling, having a job, having a family. It's obviously difficult to do both well. And
Mm-hmm.
so giving
Sure.
them more options helped more people take the plunge and maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think one thing that is sort of neglected is the fact that, part of the big decrease in births in 2020 was due to the fact that about 22% of births are to foreign moms, non-US resident native
Right.
moms. And so when they weren't able to enter the country, they plunged. And so really, we would have seen an even bigger decline in fertility due to COVID if it wasn't for remote work and some of the options that it expanded for, white collar, laptop class professional women and their husbands and families.
Yeah, yeah, and Patrick, one of the things you always do really well is you dive into the data. You've written for us, before we launched Commonplace, and I think one of the things that I always find interesting about your pieces is that it isn't just kind of this conceptual, oh, we have this feeling that this is the case, right? You really dive into the numbers, and so I don't want to put you on the spot here too much, but how do we know who was having more babies? What informs that conclusion?
Yeah, well, there's nothing wrong with vibes, right? But vibes only get you so far.
Sure.
And I do think it's important especially in this new era where I guess broadly conceived, the new right is sort of coming into its own. We've seen in just the first couple of days of the Trump administration part two, that a lot of the essays and books and things that people have written are now being translated into actual law. And so it's
Hmm.
more important than ever for those of us who are sort of, dishing out hot takes to really be thinking about, okay, what data sources are there available to help back up this? Or am I just sort of scrolling Twitter and hearing the conversations at the coffee shop and that's what's influencing my
Right.
politics? Or am I actually diving into, something that's at least partially empirically grounded? Obviously, every data set is going to have its limitations, but
Sure.
I think, for this piece, it was especially useful to look at, just some of the common sets that, the American Community Survey is one of the most commonly used sources for these things because it's a yearly survey. You can see what's happening to the population over time. And what you can see there is that services uh, you know, professional class things that people can do with their laptops, right? So
Hmm.
bookkeepers, accounting, real estate clerks, people who are able to really benefit from the shift to remote work. Those are the women, and I look specifically at married women. Those are the women who tended to self-report having had babies at a much higher rate than they did
Sure.
previous to the pandemic. And it's the people who are doing in-person work that can't be done remote, teachers,
Right.
childcare, physical therapists, those types of things. Those people are still, at a lower level compared to where they were pre-pandemic, and that makes sense, right? You think about,
Yep.
who's able to expand their choice set. And I think that's the most important lesson I think that we can take away from
Hmm.
our grand, baptism by fire into a world of remote work was
Yeah.
it gave parents more options in how they structured. And not all parents, obviously, you can't do,
Sure.
construction work or work in a hospital or something remotely. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But for people who were able to work remotely, now you're not having to spend an hour or two commuting every day. You have more options for childcare. You can work with your employer to have more hybrid or flexible scheduling, and that just
Yeah.
gave parents more options. And so I think that's really an important insight for us as we're talking about family policy and supporting parents and all that kind of stuff. It's not
Sure.
always about, well, just write parents a bigger child tax credit, although I would love to see a bigger child tax credit.
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
where are people living life in their daily reality, and how can we make it a little easier for them by giving them more options?
Yeah, that makes sense. And Patrick, I think one of the other things that you talk about a lot here is, can we keep this up, right? Your the second half of your title. What are the sorts of things that could allow this to happen? And in the piece, you talk a lot about, this could potentially be the sort of thing, working from home, remote work, that companies offer as almost like a perk or a benefit or a plus.
Yeah.
What could, and I think you did a really good job of breaking down what tangibly that could actually look like. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit to that of what could the new potential era of hybrid working or whatever you want to call it, how could that look like for real people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an employment law expert, so I don't know the, full ins and outs of how you can codify this. But I think what's most important is that we have a cultural understanding that this is an option that we should preserve. I think the
Hmm.
instinct, and even, some of our friends on the right has been, we got to get people back in the office, look at what's happening in the cities and on the trains and
Yep.
our good buddies over at Doge talking about the federal workers and all this sort of stuff. there's
Sure.
there's this sense that if you're remoting in, that you're somehow not maybe giving it your all. um Obviously there's a reason why big companies want to push a return to work.
Yeah.
I think there's valuable evidence to suggest that workers, you can get the same amount of piecemeal work done at home, but it's
Hmm.
those casual interactions, right? It's the water
Yeah,
cooler talk.
exactly.
It's the vibe check of how the office is doing, how we can be,
Sure.
collaborating more, those kind of things. You can't replicate that. And
Yep.
we've all worked remotely over the last couple of years in spits and spurts and fits and everything. There is just no way of replicating that in an all virtual environment. And so there's going to be
Right.
this gradual push. But I think as that's happening and recognizing, okay, yeah, Amazon and JP Morgan and all these companies pushing for a return to work, that's great. But let's not forget the lessons that we learned from this grand experiment that we were forced to embark on due to COVID. And
Hmm.
that's parents, and also I think, more complicated, but still important, people who are thinking about having parents too. They should be
Sure.
able
Yep.
to have as much as we can that kind of flexibility. Now, I don't think a universal right to remote work is the right way to go. We've seen politicians in the UK and the Netherlands talk about that sort of thing. I think that's way too heavy-handed. But
Sure.
creating paths, again, similar to some of the other fringe benefits that we already offer, where we're able to say this is a position that, you know, people who want to balance having a family and career, let's make that easier where you're able to kind of opt into that, and we're really going to put an effort rather than just saying, okay, everybody should be back in the office 40 hours a week. I think that we're going to forget the lessons of COVID if we do that too quickly.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You talk about the kind of creative spark you have of just chatting with someone in the office, right? The flyby conversations that really do have benefit. And so I think I want to talk a little bit about the ways that this can go wrong, or the ways this could go overboard. I think you just mentioned the European model of, this could easily shift into something where people think that they have a right to have a work from home. That
Yeah.
could be bad and could be problematic. And so I don't want to be too happy-go-lucky about, oh, well, like, everything is fine, everything will be perfect. Working from home is just like working in the office. It wasn't. And I think in your piece you make a really good point about how, if people, particularly people on the left, look at this and say, this will be a new right we will conceive of as a result of the pandemic, and we'll have litigation around this, that would also be, in a different way, forgetting what we've learned from the pandemic lesson.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I don't want to belabor the point because I think it is pretty self-evident, right? I think,
Hmm.
again, anybody who's had the experience of working both remotely and in person over the last 4 years can say, I mean, there's just obviously a qualitative difference in when you have everybody together in the same room versus when you're, can you hear me now? Or just log in, did you
Sure.
forget to unmute? All that sort of
Yep.
thing. Hey, it's just not the same. And so yeah, obviously there's huge benefits to having everybody in the same place, but there's also huge benefits to being able to take off a couple hours early to coach little league, right? Or
Yeah,
to
exactly.
just have the expectation that people aren't checking their identities as parents at the door when they come into
Hmm.
the office. I think that's something that it would be great. This was something that was by necessity what we had to do
Hmm.
during COVID,
Hmm.
where you had Paw Patrol or whatever playing in the background during a conference call. I mean, that was what we had to do, and I'm worried that if we push too much of that sense of like, well, we should all just be sort of anonymous. The veil of ignorance drops as soon as you walk through the
Sure.
office. That's not good for anybody. So if there's some flexibility, that's great. But you're right; it can obviously go overboard. I think there's you know part of what I try to get to at the end of the piece is to also say, look, it's not just bad for business, and
Hmm.
firms if we go overboard, but also for the workers themselves. It's not
Sure.
necessarily the case that a world of widespread remote work will lead to more flourishing employees, and we know
Yeah,
this
right,
because
right.
look at the cover story from Derek Thompson in the Atlantic this month talking about the antisocial
Loneliness.
century, and even after COVID, all the sort of Robert Putnam trends, bowling alone, all that sort of stuff are
Yeah.
continuing to go up because people are not using the newfound freedom of work from home to go to bingo night at the parish hall or to go to the local farmers market, whatever. They're watching
Yep.
Netflix, right?
Yeah.
And so toward the end, I love, hopefully other people are thinking about these things too. Thinking about ways that local governments and nonprofits and churches and all the rest can be thinking about ways of intentionally cultivating hubs where
Yeah.
remote workers can participate with other remote workers, right? Kind of like a co-working space, but maybe a little less formal than that. Having some
Sure.
drop-in childcare or other, playground, whatever it is that
Yeah.
with Wi-Fi or something. You can imagine different ways in different parts of the country, different ways of helping people balance those two identities because
Yeah.
it's not just simply the case. As I think I say something like, having a foot in both worlds, both work and home, can either be the best or the worst of both worlds. We don't want to just be
Yeah.
a bunch of
Exactly.
alienated, isolated workers. That would be not the right lesson to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about this towards the end when you mention, and I really enjoyed the connective tissue kind of conversation about how one of the kind of unappreciated benefits of the work from home change, the baptism by fire you talk about, was that we have more opportunities to build those connective tissues, to coach little league teams, to spend time with kids, to spend times out in the community. And so I think the co-working sort of spaces, right, away from the kind of the sheen of the WeWork sort of environment, is definitely a very valuable pursuit. But I think you make a great point too about the loneliness that's set in. And so how practically do you think we could break out from that loneliness beyond kind of trying to think differently about the way we operate in space? Is some of that a return to office? Is some of that something that government can help encourage, or is this something that communities need to kind of bind up themselves and move forward?
Yeah, both. I think, obviously, I think we all know people who benefited from, mentally from, having a break from the office, but
Sure.
we can certainly name people who, having that sort of forced isolation on them was not good for their mental
Yeah.
health. And so there's definitely going to be some people who need that more than others. And, down the line, I think the best role that government can play is to be forgiving towards coffee
Hmm.
shops and libraries and churches and community centers who want to experiment in this way. And we have,
Sure.
this is not the time for the tort reform riff, but lots of that kind of stuff that place burdens in front of these kind of experiments because of liability concerns or because of
Sure.
licensing or permitting. I would, and we saw more. I mean, think about sidewalk dining in New York City and other
Yeah.
big
Yeah.
cities
Absolutely.
during the pandemic, which was, as far as I can tell, well beloved by the people who were participating in that. And then it was kind of like, well, we need those parking spaces back. Let's clear this off the
Yep.
streets.
Yep.
To me, that's a bad way, right? We're returning
Right.
back to the status quo ante and saying, well, it was good enough in 2019. It's good enough in 2025. I would love to see more flexibility with that kind of thing. And again, I think it can look as simple as we're a cafe and we have, I know there are cafes like this that we have a play space in the back where kids can do their thing
Yep.
and parents can get a little bit of work done. That means absolving the cafe owner from, if the kid, sprains their knee or something, sprains their ankle while they're playing, now you have all these, obligations. It
Sure.
can, the insurance and all this sort of stuff. So, it would be nice to think about ways we could encourage a sense of experimentation rather than open people up for lawsuits and that sort of thing. That may not be totally within the realm of possibility, but at least those kind of things, again, churches using their nurseries for co-working spaces or that sort of thing where we're
Hmm.
saying, okay, let's reimagine the way that some of our built infrastructure is, either unused or underutilized. We can think about ways of building these sort of hub models where people can come together.
Yeah.
Because I think, especially if you're working in Boston and your coworkers are down in Austin and you have an office in Denver and you only get together once a year, you're
Right.
dropping in the office isn't an option. Well, maybe you can drop in at your local library, community center, or church, and that becomes a sort of,
Yeah.
community in microcosm.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, Patrick, I want to shift a little bit because the we have a new administration coming in. We have a new focus. One of the things we were talking about before we started recording here was the kind of realignment within the Republican Party and the way the Republican Party looks at families. And so I know you've written a lot about the child tax credit and other measures where government can be supportive of parents. But one of the pieces that, or one of the points you mentioned in your piece that I really appreciated was that to do this well, we can't just be concerned about financial concerns. We can't just be looking at these sort of financial things, but that there is a role where the government intersects with all of this. And so I know we talked a little bit there about permitting and other things, but how do you think the incoming Trump administration should look at supporting families? How do you think the new Republican Party that has a lot of new voters should look at supporting families?
Yeah, I mean that could be a topic for a series of podcasts, really. But
It's
in
very
in
fair.
a couple minutes here, I think it's important first to recognize that the shift has happened, right?
Hmm.
And Compass has written about this for years now, identifying what was happening and then pointing it out as it was happening, and now
Sure.
saying, "Look, we told you so."
Right.
This
Things are different now.
realignment. Yeah, exactly. We live the realignment has happened in a limited sense, in the sense that like college educated voters have now increasingly shifted over to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is, predominantly now the base is non-college Americans and of all races, right? And
Hmm.
so, in some respects, the things that Henry Olsen and Patrick Rafiti and Orrin Cass and others have been writing about for years is now coming to pass. And the question is, who is channeling that energy into policymaking, right? Is it, uh, pouring new wine into old wineskins, and we say, okay, we have this
Right.
populist energy. Now we're going to pass our imagination of the child tax credit circa 2009 or
Exactly.
2004 or whatever, which is, I think, still the tendency among a lot, but not maybe not the majority, but certainly a heavy plurality of people in Congress. But
Hmm.
then there's obviously a lot of conversations around recognizing the new reality. That is, working class Americans don't have a huge amount of federal tax liability to forgive in the first place. And so if
Right.
you're just saying, well, the child tax credit should only be for people who owe federal income tax at the end of the year, and if you make less than median income, well, you don't owe anything, so that we can do anything for you. That's not a sufficient answer. And so,
Right.
yes, it is not just finances. Yes, it has to be a sort of cultural and really broad based understanding of where the
Hmm.
pain points on parents are. Supporting family, supporting marriage, all that kind of stuff. But finances also play a role too, and I think that is going to be the big debate coming up in the next couple of months that we'll see in Congress. Is that sort of reflexive? There's a stark difference between tax credits on the one hand and welfare on the other hand, and
Hmm.
versus, look, if people are working and paying into the system, they're bearing the costs of raising kids, and we should be doing something else to help them with it. Otherwise, our birth rates are continuing to go down, and families are going to feel more and more under the gun. I think that's where I'd
Yeah.
love to see that energy on the right continue to shift.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Patrick, I'm kind of an eternal optimist about the changing nature of American politics. That has, as you can imagine, not always proved to be the case. That has not been the right disposition in many cases. One thing, though, from the 2024 election that I found encouraging, if you think this is a fair categorization, is that it seemed like maybe for the first time in my adult lifetime, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were competing for votes of parents. And there was an actual debate about the child tax credit and what it should look like. Do you think that's a fair way to categorize, again, maybe this like kind of micro realignment within this one specific area of policy? And if so, do you think that there could be some creative flourishing there where there could be benefits?
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of an arms race around the CTC during the
Yeah.
campaign, and I don't want to. I completely support your right to be an eternal optimist. I'm always more of a glass half empty kind of guy, and I think it's not no accident that when Vice President now Vance mentioned a pretty high dollar amount for the CTC during the campaign. It wasn't like President Trump and his campaign, jumped at the chance to meet him where he was on that one. So I think there's
Yeah.
still a big question about where the White House is going to come down in some of these negotiations. And obviously, I hope that they recognize that prioritizing the CTC will be a way of delivering for families across the board in a way that just cutting, top tax rates or full expensing for businesses or something. I mean,
Sure.
those
Yeah.
are not broad-based tax concerns for the majority of working class families. So, yeah, there's a shift. I do think that there is, you know, full credit to the left,
Hmm.
to a degree, right? I mean, they've always been a little more attuned to the economic pressures facing families. I mean, you could think about, the 80s and 90s, Elizabeth Warren in the early 2000s. I mean, there's this sort of tradition on the left of, well, if we just spend enough money, then, we can
Sure.
solve
Our
all people's
problems will
problems.
all
And I think
go
we
away.
saw,
Yeah.
right, exactly. And I think we saw during the initial, those that 6 months during the Biden administration where they were sending out
Hmm.
monthly child tax credit checks that weren't as popular as the left assumed it would be, as I frankly thought they would be. And that was because, and I wrote this
Hmm.
for, I think, for Compass at the time and for other places,
Just gonna
it was
say, yeah.
because, right, there was no connection to that idea of you have to pay into the system, right? And that,
Yep.
if we're just giving it to everybody, regardless of whether they're working, it starts to look a lot like welfare rather than a subsidy, a recognition of the cost that working class parents bear. And so that's a really important insight for the sort
Hmm.
of realignment, right? To recognize, okay, there's still these values, very profoundly conservative values about work and family and all the rest that go along with this reorientation. But at the same time, it can't just be lip service either. And I think we
Sure.
see
Yep.
other think tanks in DC, and I won't mention them because they're friends of ours, but
Fair.
sometimes they will say things that sound great and are wonderful, lip service to supporting families and having a full, all of government approach to
Yep.
fertility and marriage, all the rest. And then it's like, okay, well, do you support expanding the child tax credit? They say, well, we're not in favor of welfare. It's like, well, you can't
Yeah,
have it
yep,
both ways. You have to be willing to bite the bullet on putting your money where your mouth is. And so,
yeah.
yes, we should be talking. Yes, there's a bunch of cultural things we can be doing to make it easier for families, but also, that doesn't pay the bills at the end of the month either. So both
Yeah,
and.
that's yeah, both and. I think that makes total sense. And one point you make it in this piece, you've made it in a number of other pieces, and I think you make it really well, is one of the other things that we have to recognize is that supporting families is a fundamentally conservative value, right? Patrick, you know the criticism that we get again from some of our friends here in DC, from other places that, this is we shouldn't just be doling out money. We've got this huge national debt. We can't afford to be doing these sorts of things. And to me, it really strikes me that we can't afford not to be doing many of these things, right? And that supporting American families, I can't think of a policy area or a mission focus that could be more fundamentally conservative. But I wonder if you could explain that a little bit and how those
Yeah.
two things tick and tie.
Well, that's a very kind of generous way of saying that. I sound like a one-trick pony, but no, it's true though, because it is the most important. I mean, it's what I write a lot about, because I think it's one of the most important things on the right. I mean, I think
Yep.
the you know the challenge that we face is not convincing our fellow conservatives that families matter. We all agree that. I mean,
Sure.
we can debate around the edges about what that actually looks like in practice, and marriage and all the rest. But at a fundamental level, I think one thing that unites, the vast majority of people on the right is wanting
Hmm.
to support the family as the essential building block of a healthy
Yeah.
society. If the family's gone wrong, no government program is going to fix it. That's a Michael Novak quote from the '70s. I mean, this has been a long strain on the right, and the question is, what does that look like under the present, economic conditions that we're in?
Hmm.
What does it look like under a backdrop of plunging fertility globally and declining marriage rates? We want to be smart about it. I'm not somebody, even some of the proposals that we see on the Hill, where we're talking about, doubling or more the size of the child tax
Hmm.
credit. I think some of those verge on the skirt fiscal responsibility to a certain
Sure.
degree. We want to make sure we're not just blowing out the deficit just for the heck of it, because that puts pressure on interest rates, right? And that makes it
Yeah.
harder
Right.
for people to buy a house and start a family and all the rest. So
Yep.
you
Buy
have to keep these things.
groceries.
Exactly. And so you have to keep these intention. You want to be smart about it, but at the same time, that doesn't mean hamstringing ourselves. And it's just too convenient to say, well, we can't afford a more generous child tax credit, but let's do no tax on tips, or tax-free
Sure.
social security benefits, or full expensing for corporations, because we can afford those things. But when it comes to families and new children and all the expenses associated with that, well, baby bonuses or something like that, those are just, that's a bridge too far. We can't afford that. We have to
Sure.
prioritize. And I think, again, if we believe what we say, that families
Hmm.
are at the core of a healthy society, recognizing that not all the things that oppress or that make life more difficult for parents are the evil left or big
Yeah.
corporations or big tech or whatever. I mean, those can be fought. We should and can fight them, but recognize that the economy also plays a role here too, and that making it easier to start a family, to buy a house, all that stuff is an important and essential part of a pro-family agenda.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think your prioritization point is a really valuable one, and one that I think, particularly in the excitement of a new administration, can kind of get lost from the conversation, right? It's a you're in a playhouse. You can do whatever you want. The world is your oyster. So if you were advising either Republicans on the Hill or the Trump administration, saying where do we want to invest our political capital? Where are the things that we really want to be having the fights out as we start the new administration? Where would you direct them to look?
Well, I think my advice is different if I'm talking to the White House versus Congress, because those are two different constitutional roles. And I think
Sure.
in some respects, I mean, Congress is going to have their job made easier for them if the White House tells them what to prioritize. And I think that's
Yeah,
where we
right.
are as we're recording this right now. Are we doing one bill? Are we doing two bills? All these sort of things. What's going to be included in the final package? It's a little bit like, trying to pack for a week-long vacation, but you can only check a carry-on, right? Or something. Like,
Yeah,
you got to figure out
sure.
what you're going to put in, what you're going to leave behind. And right now, the campaign trail. I mean, everything under the sun was being thrown out. You got to pick and choose what's going to be included. And so, if the White House wanted to come out swinging for, pick two or three things, right? No tax on tips seems to be a pretty popular one. I think it's
Sure.
kind of silly, but that's fine. It's a nice gesture of goodwill to people who work in service, working class sector jobs. Okay, fine. We do that. We do the child tax credit, maybe baby bonus in there because that's not actually that expensive, and
Hmm.
maybe one other big thing, probably salt. Um, and let's have those be our three priorities, right? And then everything else we'll do the jigsaw puzzle to fit in how
Sure.
much we can afford, where the pay for is, raising the endowment tax, whatever that looks like, to keep this from being a huge CBS score, right?
Yeah.
I
Right.
think that's how I would like to see things proceed. And the White House doesn't need to be writing legislative text. This isn't Obamacare where the White
Hmm.
House was sort of dictating to Congress what it needed to look like. I mean, there's a healthy respect that Mike Johnson and others on the Hill are going to have to figure out a bill that can pass their own caucus, but they need to know which direction to be pointing the ship in, right? And if the White House is able to kind of just set those broad strokes of here are our top priorities, I think that would be good. And then for the White House, I think you know, I obviously again spending money is great. I just gave this whole speech about how we
Sure.
need to be
Yep.
thinking about where we should be increasing our outlays, but there's obviously never going to be any shortage of regulations that we can be tackling that will make it more affordable to raise a family. Obviously, housing is something
Sure.
that I care deeply about. I think the president signed an executive order on his first day in office, trying to
Hmm.
tackle some of the regulatory burdens that push up the price of housing. And so, talking
Yeah.
about zoning and land use and all the rest of that, I think there's stuff that the White House could do to loosen some of the regulatory constraints around high cost sectors of the economy, like housing and healthcare and some of these other places. I think that will be a really productive use of
Hmm.
the White House's time to focus on that because those are things you can do with the stroke of a pen, and it would be great
Yeah.
to see a focus on that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think one of the other things kind of lost in this conversation is that it isn't all about new things, right? So much of this is about cutting back the things that hamstring families today. And so when you
Yeah.
talk about regulation, it is the sort of thing that is a lot easier to cut. It is the sort of thing that's easier to roll back. And again, you know this area a lot better than I do, but I would imagine those are the sorts of changes, be they housing laws and zoning laws, that redound to the benefit of families more than cutting back a lot of other regulations.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be smart about it. One area that I think is particularly tricky is
Hmm.
childcare because I think
Yeah.
everybody kind of has this sense, well, if we just deregulate childcare, then the market will clear and it will become more affordable. I think, there's a little bit of truth to that in the sense that, some states have higher ratio of how many staff you have to have around that sort of thing. But there
Hmm.
comes a limit, right? Because you
Right.
don't want to just say,
Sure.
well, toss 20 kids in a basement and let them fight it out,
Yeah.
Lord of the Flies style,
Lord of the
right? I mean, there's
Flies is fine. Yeah, they'll entertain
exactly.
themselves. Yeah.
The kids, most of them are too young to talk, so they can't actually tell you if anything's going wrong. So there's actually a reason why we have fundamental regulations around childcare. Now, obviously, do some of those go too far? 100%. But the way, again, this is where there's competing strands on the right? Where you have some,
Hmm.
I would say, more libertarian folks who say, well, let's just, rip it up and kind of let the market take care of things. And it's like, no, that's not a really conservative way of approaching because you're trying to
Right.
preserve the value of, healthy kids, healthy families, all that sort of stuff. Finding the right balance there. It's not a one size fits all solution, but at least if our impulse is let's figure out what has been accreting over time where we can strip it down to the very essentials, focus on health and safety rather than, well, did you get this credential, do you have enough employees
Right.
in a certificate program and all those sort of things that can kind of get unthinking or sometimes thinkingly added on by progressive administrations and the Obama administration. Those are areas you can scale those back easily. And another thing is like the folks on the left love to keep pushing the envelope and how generous they can make federal programs.
Right.
So under the Obama administration, the last year of the Obama administration, they cut the percentage of I'm sorry, I'm getting the weeds here, but basically they changed the law, making it so the amount of money people have to pay to participate in federal child care was lowered, and there are blue states who want to keep pushing that lower, basically down to
Right.
zero. And there's no, you're basically just saying, okay, we're going to take our fixed pot of money and spend more and more of it per family, rather than saying,
Hmm.
let's try to give all families a little bit extra through supporting the child tax credit, or even a young child supplement for the child tax credit. Those type of things are much more egalitarian way of going about family policy than trying to say, well, let's subsidize this type of childcare versus others.
Sure, yeah, and I think probably one of the other areas where there's a lot of kind of philosophical value here is in the wisdom of federalism, right? I think one of the things that the pandemic, obviously harmfully in many ways, it played out this way, but by providing funds and support at a baseline level with child tax credit or other things, I think you allow different states to take different approaches. And so maybe you do have more heavy-handed regulations that don't work out so well in a state like New York, but in other states, in North Carolina, for example, you may not have those sorts of things, and you can have those individual benefits, right? There's a little bit, I think, of the laboratories of democracy element here, particularly for something as fundamental as supporting families.
Yeah, it's always funny to see federalism sort of wax and wane with whoever's in the White House. It was like,
Fair, yeah,
2017 to 2021, all of a sudden there was this strange new respect for federalism from
yeah.
our friends on the left. And look, there are examples of blue states actually putting their money where their mouth is in terms of like, yeah, a lot of them are kind of fairly aggressive, heavy-handed,
Hmm.
gender ideology and reproductive rights amendments and all those sort of things. And okay, it's California, it's New York. What are you going to do? But New York
Sure.
also just expanded access to paid leave for prenatal visits. They're talking about doing a baby bonus where parents will get new money at the time the child is born rather than having to wait for the following tax year. They're talking about giving new parents a basket of goods when they leave the hospital to make sure they have the
Hmm.
essentials for those first days of parenthood. I mean, those are kind of creative ideas that I would love to
Yeah,
see more red states doing too. Now, obviously, Tennessee is never going to have the same
sure.
fiscal capacity to do something creative like California or Massachusetts. We wouldn't want it to, but there are things we can learn. And again, some of the stuff doesn't cost a ton of money. Tennessee, for example, just passed in the past year or two a waiver to their state Medicaid program, where
Hmm.
moms on their Medicaid program now are able to get diapers for free, covered
Right.
under Medicaid, as a way of saying, look, we know this can be an expense. We want to be there to support low income and working class parents. Here's a way that the state can actually, materially alleviate some of the costs associated
Yeah.
with having a kid. I'd love to see more red states experimenting with that kind of thing. I think that would be a really fun and exciting use of state power, because there's a lot that people can do on that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. You wrote a piece for us a couple months back. It's time for a bonus baby. I really I usually my heckles come up a little bit when there's an exclamation point in a title as an editor, but I saw that and I was like, that's it. That's really good. But one of the points that I think you made was, the one that is very intuitive, I'm sure, to any parent, particularly any new parent, but it's just the enormous cost of that leaving the hospital, right? Of everything you have to do on day one. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about those different kind of more creative ways to approach it is that these aren't high costs. It's not just about writing a check. It's if you can if you can reorient the way that you look at what Medicaid covers and what Medicare covers, then you can have a different sort of view into supporting families that isn't going to bust a budget. It's not going to presumably draw as much criticism.
Yeah, and I think about in a different context. Marco Rubio, when he was in the Senate, had a bill
Hmm.
that was responding to the Dobbs decision and trying to think about ways that we can better support pregnant moms and families. And it
Yeah.
was about using federal money to kind of capacitate or to accelerate the work that so many churches and pregnancy centers and others around the country already do. I think that's the right model to say,
Yeah.
look, the federal government isn't good at a lot of things. Maybe it's only good at
Yeah.
some things, but one thing it is good at doing is writing checks to people. And so that's something
Hmm.
that is sort of, and it has the Federal Reserve, it has the printing power. Like
That's right.
a baby bonus or child tax credit. That's something that's fairly simple. You can do that as part of the Social Security system. Some of these other things, like building a web of support around a pregnant mom and making sure that she has somewhere to turn when she's feeling like she, is isolated, or the
Hmm.
remote worker who, is feeling isolated because they don't have that sort of social interaction that their coworkers do. Those type of things, that's not. I don't want a federal program.
Right.
The U.S. Department of Remote Work hybrid hubs.
Sure.
Like no, no,
Yeah.
that's not what I'm talking about. But we can use some of the community development block grant money or whatever to build parks and neighborhood centers and to give a grant to the United Way or the library system or whoever to think
Hmm.
about ways of creatively respond to the needs of their local community. It's going to look different in
Yep.
different places. But that's where I think we, again, tapping into existing pots of money or maybe a little bit of new money here or there, but saying, let's turn this over to, the lowest authority available, that concept of subsidiarity, saying,
Yep.
let's devolve this down to the people who are interacting on the go, not the groups, right? Not the interest groups, but the people who are already in the communities working on a daily
Hmm.
basis. I think that's the direction that a lot of our social policy should be going. And yeah, sometimes that's going to mean spending less on certain things, and sometimes it'll be
Sure.
spending more.
Yep.
But it's that way of reorienting, again, where people are living their life and how we can be responding to. It's not just about. It is often about material need, but it's not just about that. And I think
Yep.
recognizing that need for meaning and for purpose and belonging is an important part of politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the points you really hit on well in your piece is that you talk about trade-offs and how at a fundamental level, one of the things that we should be doing differently is weighing the trade-offs when it comes to supporting American families. And so I want to be conscientious of your time, but if you could speak a little bit to that, what are these sorts of trade-offs and what haven't we done well previously in weighing those trade-offs up until this point, and what do you hope might be different with a new administration and with kind of a new Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, you can think about the trade-offs both monetarily and culturally, right? And I think in the piece I mentioned that basically what we did during COVID was we took the burden of being a working parent and we redistributed that a little bit, right? Where in the
Hmm.
in the pre times, again, if you're expected to work 40 hours a week and you have a 45-minute commute, I mean, that's your employer's time and you have to
Yep.
ask special permission to opt out of that, right? Can I got to take, sometimes, in an office, like, oh, you can only take paid leave in 4 hour increments, or maybe you don't have paid leave at all. And so
Yep. Yeah.
it becomes this really sharp trade off of like, I'd love to go to the choir concert, but I can't get off of work that early. That type of
Sure.
thing. We were able to in the pandemic because of the expanded options available. Not every parent, obviously, but more were able to experiment with different ways that maybe I'm only working from the office 2 days a week or whatever. Those type of things are a way of asking employers to shoulder a little more of that burden
Hmm.
because as we've talked about, it is a little more friction, a little more sometimes expense, or just you don't have quite as close control or monitoring of what your employees are up to, and so it requires a little more trust,
Yeah.
and it can be a cost to your coworkers as well. But we're saying it's worth,
Sure. Yep.
at that time it was worth it to have working parents continue to participate. I think that's something we should continue to persist with. I think that is incredibly valuable for parents to have that kind of flexibility, and also for parents who aren't working in these sort of remote work friendly jobs to give them the stability of
Yeah.
knowing your schedule in advance and being able to plan ahead rather than finding out from your big box employer what your hours are the
Yeah.
next day or the day after. I mean, that's not conducive to family life either. So again, that's a trade-off. That's saying, look,
Exactly. Yep.
your
Exactly.
profit margins are going to be a little slimmer because you might not be able to flex your workforce as much as you were, but it's
Hmm.
important for working parents. I think that's the kind of thing that we can do. And then the tax code is obviously not a very like romantic part of our policymaking
Hmm.
process,
You
but
beat me
the
to what
child
was
tax.
going to be my final question, because you also wrote an excellent piece for us about the tax code and how the upcoming tax fight intersects with all of this. So.
Yeah, no, but it does because
Hmm.
the child tax credit is a way of essentially now, and Vice President Vance got in a little trouble framing it in this way, but it's true. It's essentially saying let's tax everybody, including people who don't have
Hmm.
kids, to provide a benefit, if you will, or a
Hmm.
reduced tax burden for people who do have kids. And it's a horizontal transfer, recognizing that parents have these costs and that non-parents don't, and that as a society we have an obligation to make sure that we're trying to make it a little easier for parents to carry on, because as the economy grows, these costs grow too. That
Hmm.
to me is it's a trade-off, right? And
Yep.
again, you have to be considerate about how this fits in with all the other factions of the tax code, but that is asking our fellow citizens to bear a little burden to recognize that there is something important about persisting as a
Yeah.
nation, as a
Yeah.
country, as a
Absolutely.
people, And that's a trade-off we should be 100% willing to take, no matter what like Reddit child free forums have to say. I think
Sure.
that's what our politics should be about.
Absolutely. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the conversation. Thank you for writing the piece. Thank you for helping us launch Commonplace. We really appreciate your time and your energy and your thinking on all of this.
Always happy to. Thanks, Drew.
And we'll be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.